Good evening and welcome to this panel discussion to learn about juvenile justice. My name is Doreen Binder. I'm president of the League of Women Voters of Portland, and I will be moderating this evening's panel. We'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that we are assembling here on the occupied sacred lands and waters of the indigenous Chinook people. We will never be as effective a steward as they, though we can certainly aspire to be with everything that we can do. This evening's program is sponsored by the League of Women Voters of Portland. The League works to empower voters and defend democracy. We encourage the informed and active participation in government. This program is recorded by Metro East Community Media for rebroadcast on public access channels and will be available online viewing at the League of Women Voters Portland website soon afterwards. Our program is supported by generous donations from the Multnomah Bar Foundation and the Carol and Selma Sailing Foundation. We are grateful for their support and for the generosity of our speakers and volunteers in bringing you this program, as well as Multnomah County for providing the venue. Our topic tonight addresses juvenile justice in Oregon. Oregon incarcerates young people at a higher rate than almost any other state, according to the report from the Oregon Council on Civil Rights. African Americans in Multnomah County are 13 times more likely to be indicted than their white peers. The cost of incarcerating teens are high, nearly $100,000 a year per child. In the face of these statistics and emerging research on brain development in children and adolescents, lawmakers are evaluating ways to update Measure 11, the initiative that required mandatory minimum sentencing that applies to all defendants 15 years and older. Tonight's program will examine some of the ideas being explored to improve outcomes for our youth and for our communities. After planning this program, the League received requests from the Oregon Justice Center and from the Multnomah County District Attorney's Office to join the panel. Although the requests came after the program was set, we think that their interest indicates how important the issue is to our community, and we regret not having enough time this evening to include additional speakers with their expertise and experience. All of tonight's speakers will give a short overview of their perspective and work on the issues of juvenile justice. After all the speakers have finished their opening remarks, they will have a chance to comment or question each other. I may have some additional questions to ask, and I will ask the questions that you will provide to me. There should be cards and pens going around if you have questions you'd like to ask. We encourage audience members to write questions to the speakers, and I will ask them. So League members will be walking around collecting them. Our first speaker tonight is Kimberly McCullough. Kimberly is the Policy Director for the American Civil Liberties Union of Oregon. Her work is to advance the goals of the ACLU on a broad range of issues, including juvenile justice, through engagement with the legislature, public agencies, and other governing bodies across the state. Kimberly, will you give us an overview of how Measure 11 has affected juvenile justice and what steps have been taken or planned to mitigate the harmful effects of the measure? You have 10 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the introduction, Doreen, and thank you to the League of Women Voters for hosting this very important event on what we consider to be a really crucial issue for the state of Oregon to address. So I am going to talk a bit about Measure 11 in some broad strokes, give you some history and some context to its passage, and talk a little bit about what we have learned since Measure 11 was passed, and also just talk a little bit about how Measure 11 plays out in different places in our state. So to start out, Measure 11 was passed. It's a ballot measure that was passed in 1994. It impacted both youth and adults. So it wasn't just about juveniles, although that's the piece of it that we're going to be talking about today. So in very broad strokes, it created mandatory minimums for a certain subset of serious crimes, crimes that are considered to be person crimes or violent crimes. As it pertains to youth, what it did is it took, for those specific crimes, it took youth who are 15 years and older, and if they are charged with one of those crimes, they are automatically waived into adult court. What that means is that instead of being adjudicated in our juvenile justice system, in the juvenile courts, they then go to adult court and they are tried as adults. And when they are tried as adults, they are then subject to those mandatory adult sentences, minimum adult sentences. So essentially what Measure 11 did in that regard is it took the power away from judges who had previously been making decisions about whether or not a youth would be tried as a youth or as an adult, and it put that power in the hands of the district attorney when they're making the decision about whether or not to charge that youth with a Measure 11 crime. I think it's important to note that at the same time that ballot measure 11 was passed, there was another ballot measure that was passed, ballot measure 10, and it intersects with ballot measure 11 because what it said was that when the people create a criminal sentence by popular vote, so by a ballot measure vote, that criminal sentence cannot be reduced by the legislature unless they have a supermajority vote. So they need a 2/3 majority vote in order to reduce that criminal sentence. Without getting too sort of lawyerly and wonky about it, there is some dispute about exactly how far ballot measure 10 extends. I think we all agree that when the people voted that, you know, a certain crime has a 75-month sentence, if we reduce that to 70 months, that is a reduction in the sentence. But there are other ways that we can change that statutory scheme, that we can change the provisions of a ballot measure that may ultimately have some effect on the sentence that gets carried out. But some of those changes may be to procedures. And so there's some debate about when exactly does ballot measure 10 require that supermajority. After ballot measure 11 was passed, there immediately following that, there was Senate Bill 1 the following year in 1995 that really restructured and changed a lot of ballot measure 11. And then there's a number of changes that have happened in the years following that have also changed it. So the structure has changed somewhat. So I think very important context to talk about when we talk about ballot measure 11 is what was happening in 1994 in the United States. It was a time when it was, you know, really what we now refer to as our tough on crime era. It was also the time of this idea of the super predator. There was a lot of fear that youth crime was on the rise and that it was just going to keep getting, you know, higher and higher and higher and higher rates of crime because there was somehow youth that were essentially not really kids, and that they were somehow just incredibly dangerous, and we needed to do something to respond to that. I think it's important to note that the person who actually came up with the terminology super predator then later disclaimed that terminology and said he shouldn't have actually come up with that idea. He also admitted that his predictions were incorrect. Other things that we have learned since then that I think are really important is that you know, kids are fundamentally different than adults. They can and do commit serious crimes, but they have very unique characteristics that are really different from adults and that really impact the way that we can help them to habilitate and to reintegrate into society. Kids' brains are not fully developed, and we now know that they're not fully developed until they're about 25 years old. And so up until that point, right, their prefrontal cortex is not functioning at the level that an adult's does. They don't have the same understanding of the long-term impact of what's happening. They don't have the same impulse control that adults have. They don't really understand the risks and rewards of what they're doing. They're also incredibly susceptible to peer pressure. We also know that in that time period that passes after a youth may have engaged in certain kinds of behavior, as they develop and they become an adult, and once they hit that age of 25, they really become a completely different person. And so there is just this vast capacity for growth and for learning and understanding what they did and learning and understanding, you know, different ways of behaving, pro-social ways of behaving. And so they really can become these just completely different people who are safe to re-enter society, and who can lead really healthy and productive lives. So how Measure 11 operates varies across the state. It varies across the state because of the fact that different district attorneys' offices have different policies of how they implement Measure 11, right? So they can make decisions about whether or not to charge a youth as an adult, whether or not to charge them with a Measure 11 crime and have them be automatically waived. They can do a variety of different things. And so, and that also has other impacts. One thing that I think is important to note is that there is something that's called a second look hearing, which is when someone has a significant sentence after a certain portion of their sentence has passed, they can go to a judge and show the progress that they've made and try to show to that judge that they are actually safe to return to society. When someone is automatically waived into adult court under a Measure 11, they lose their right to that second look hearing. So that's also a thing that district attorneys' offices can, they can make decisions about. And in particular, in plea agreements, when they're, as we know, most of our cases in the criminal justice system don't actually go to trial, right? They're resolved through plea agreements. So there's district attorneys' offices can make decisions about what to put in that plea agreement. So whether or not a youth is waived into adult court is one of those decisions. Multnomah County, where we're located right now, I think is a good example of how Measure 11 impacts youth in different parts of our state differently. They made the decision in 2016 not to charge certain youth with Measure 11 offenses if they're charged with what's called a Tier 2 Measure 11 offense. So there's Tier 1 and Tier 2. There are different levels of severity of those offenses. So for Tier 2, if a youth meets a whole bunch of different criteria, the district attorney's office has decided not to charge those youth with Measure 11 sentences or with Measure 11 crimes. I also understand that they have a juvenile justice reinvestment program in Multnomah County that provides alternatives to incarceration for youth who are charged with those Tier 2 Measure 11 offenses. And my understanding, although I have to say I'm an attorney, but I'm a policy advocate. I'm not a criminal defense attorney. I'm not a prosecutor. I don't practice in that area of law, so that's my caveat. But my understanding is that Multnomah County also made the decision not to ask youth to waive into adult court in plea agreements. So, we see these as steps in the right direction. They are reforms to Measure 11, which we really think needs to be reformed. We certainly would like to see change happen statewide, however, instead of just in one county, and we would like to see more progressive reforms. So our hope is that Multnomah County, being one of those counties where they've decided to start changing things, that they will join us in calling for change statewide. So I want to just I've already touched on brain development and how that impacts things. I just want to touch on a few other things that really are driving our desire to change Measure 11 and to change the way that youth are treated in our criminal justice system. Prosecution of kids in the criminal justice system, putting them into the adult criminal justice system is actually, in our opinion, bad for public safety. Youth who are prosecuted in the adult system are actually 34% more likely to commit additional crimes than youth who are actually handled in the youth system. In addition, Measure 11 and our juvenile justice system more broadly have a disproportionate impact on youth of color, LGBT youth, kids with disabilities, and a variety of other groups. And then the other thing is that, and particularly related to youth with disabilities, 88% of young men and 75% of young women in Oregon Youth Authority custody have at least one diagnosed mental health disorder. 22% of them have experienced at least one foster care episode, and 25% have a record of substantiated child maltreatment. So these are kids that have been through a lot. They've been traumatized. They're facing a lot of difficulties, and in our opinion, what they need from us is help and support and resources and to be treated in a way that we know will actually have positive outcomes for them and for public safety.
Thank you, Kimberly. Thank you. Our next speaker is Deanna Horn of the Metropolitan Public Defender Service, and she has represented many young people in Measure 11 cases. Deanna, will you share your perspective on how our current juvenile justice system impacts long-term outcomes for youth and how we can improve on what we're doing, please?
So I have been a public defender for 15 years, and it's actually difficult for me to talk with my sitting down. So if I wave my hands around a lot, it's because I'd rather be pacing. Sorry. I represent both adults and juveniles in the ballot measure 11 system currently. I have also previously represented juveniles in both the dependency world, where they are subject to foster care placement, and also in the delinquency world, where they are charged with, if they were adults, they would be charged with a crime. And the one thing I can tell you for certain is that at every step of this system, our communities of color are disparately impacted. Our communities of color are disparately impacted when it comes to foster care. And we know from research that kids are damaged when we remove them from their families. And the more foster care placements that we give them, the more instability that they have as children, the more at risk they are to be involved in the criminal justice system later. And that system disparately impacts our communities of color. We know that juvenile delinquency, when you're taking a kid and actually appropriately treating them in juvenile court for something that would be a crime if they were an adult, also disparately impacts communities of color. That it is more likely that a child of color will have a petition, a filing in juvenile court, than a white child whose case might be dealt with in a much more informal kind of manner, things that are open in the juvenile court. And we know from data in Multnomah County that ballot measure 11 treatment of juveniles disparately impacts our communities of color. It's a birth to prison pipeline that we're putting our communities of color through here in Multnomah County. Now, I applaud Rod Underhill for looking at data that he got from Portland State University and being horrified, seeing on paper this birth to prison pipeline that was being created here in Portland, and saying, hey, I've got to do something about these juvenile ballot measure 11s. And so making a list of criteria for maybe not charging a kid in an adult court with a ballot measure 11, instead of making a different choice to charge them with maybe a lesser offense that would have them involved in the juvenile justice system. He's also allowed us, when they've charged ballot measure 11 offenses against youth on these tier 2 crimes, and I'll talk about what they're talking about tier 1 and tier 2 crimes are. They've allowed the defense community to put together mitigation packages for these youth and to advocate with the district attorney's office that, hey, we need to return this child from adult court to juvenile court. That has happened. I have 2 clients right now where that's happening. It doesn't happen for every child, though. When we talk about ballot measure 11 offenses, we're talking about everything from murder, which is we know what that is. That's pretty darn bad. All the way down to something called like a robbery in the second degree. A robbery in the second degree is one of these tier 2 crimes, and it's my favorite one to describe how kids get wrapped up in the juvenile justice system. Because robbery in the second degree can be committed in any number of ways. One is walking into a convenience store with your hand in your pocket and pretending you have a gun and saying, I have a gun, give me all the money, and you don't really have a gun. That doesn't make the clerk any less frightened, certainly. But that's a robbery in the second degree, a tier 2 ballot measure 11 offense. The other way a robbery in the second degree can be committed is if you're with a bunch of other folks. If you're with a bunch of your peers. If you're a teenager and you're going along with the crowd, and a bunch of you surround somebody and snatch a cell phone out of that person's hand and run away with it. You've aided another person actually present in that robbery, and that's a ballot measure 11 offense, and that carries a mandatory minimum sentence of 70 months in prison for a juvenile charged in adult court, unless I can do something to get them back. Have you ever heard anything more teenagery than a bunch of kids getting together and deciding to do something stupid? Assault in the second degree is another one that can be committed like that, or with a bunch, just kind of ganged up on somebody and beat somebody up, or you hit them, or you get into a fight with somebody and you pick up your skateboard and you hit them with your skateboard. I've had that juvenile case where the skateboard is a weapon, and now I have a client looking at 70 months of incarceration in the adult system. Look, we don't send them to prison when they're 15. We send them to the Oregon Youth Authority when they're 15. But we can send them to the Oregon Department of Corrections when they turn 18. And if you've given them 70 months, they're past the time they're 18. So this has really serious impacts, not only on these kids that, as Kimberly pointed out, may have all kinds of reasons for being in a situation that they're in, but it has impacts on families. These kids have parents and grandparents and siblings who love them. And no family's perfect. I mean, mine's not, for goodness sakes. But each child deserves to be loved by their family, and each family that loves a child deserves to know that that child is safe. And when you get these kids caught up in ballot measure 11s, we have a lot of moms staying awake a lot of nights. And that has a disparate impact on our communities of color as well. I promised myself I would set a timer so I wouldn't talk longer than my 10 minutes, and I totally forgot to do that. So how am I doing?
Couple minutes.
A couple minutes, okay. We know how to take the outliers in our community, the 15-year-old that commits murder, and it looks like it's really bad. We know how to treat that person without ballot measure 11 because we did it before. It's not that because ballot measure came along, all of a sudden now we're prosecuting kids in adult court for the first time in Oregon history. We had a waiver statute before, and as a matter of fact, that waiver statute still exists. I did several years ago, I actually did a waiver hearing in Eastern Oregon for a 14-year-old murderer because he didn't fall under Measure 11, so he got a waiver hearing. And the judge had to make an individualized determination, looking at that child, looking at the horror that had been his life, looking at the mental health diagnoses that he had, looking at his lack of functioning, to make a decision. And it had the input of the district attorney's office. They presented a very robust case. It had the input of a defense team. I think we did a really good job because we won. It had the input of victims' families. We'll hear from the district attorney's office that victims' families want ballot measure 11. But do we hear their voices in this system? Before, in a waiver hearing, we did. They got to come in and tell a judge what they wanted to have happen and why they wanted it to happen that way. And we got to hear family voices too. So we know how to do that. Throwing out ballot measure jurisdiction for kids, which I guess is probably no surprise where I think we should be. Doesn't mean you throw out the baby with the bathwater. In this context, that's probably a really bad saying, but we don't give up. If you find that juvenile that really needs to be treated in the adult system, we know how to do that. So.
Thank you, Dan. Our next speaker, because we're a little out of order here, our next speaker is Babak, am I saying that right? Okay. Zulfagari Azar. Babak is a family care manager for the Community Healing Initiative at Portland Opportunities Industrial Center at the Rosemary Anderson High School. He works with African American youth and their families in Portland and works with community partners to educate middle and high school students about Measure 11. Babak, will you tell us about your work and how you see it as a pathway to improving outcomes for youth with whom you work?
Of course. Good evening, everyone. Right on. All right. Thank you, Doreen and the League of Women Voters, for giving me the opportunity to speak about public education on Measure 11 and to really humanize the stories behind the impacts of Measure 11. What I'll have is a slideshow that's playing through photos of families that I've worked with, that I currently work with, who've been impacted by Measure 11. Devon here right now, his mother here, Dominica, is here to support him while he's in custody right now. But I'll talk about their stories, the impacts, and also education. So 2 years ago, in August of 2016, there was a judge's listening session, PCC Cascade, and I went into that to really listen to what the community felt were their concerns about the juvenile justice system. And almost every family member that went up to speak about their concerns brought up Measure 11. And I actually felt kind of foolish having gone to grad school and not really heard too much about Measure 11, things here and there, but to hear the community over and over again talking about the impacts of Measure 11, how it damaged their children, their young daughters, young sons, cousins, friends, really drew a lot of attention to a need to go into schools and educate youth about Measure 11. So what we started was Measure 11 Pathway to Prevention workshop, and we've reached over 500 students across 17 different workshops and 10 high schools and middle schools, right? Because that's the thing, is what we've learned is that 87% of the youth that we've spoken to, they don't know what Measure 11 is. 87% in the schools we've gone to don't know what Measure 11 is. And there's that layer of once they come into contact in the system, that's when they learn what Measure 11 is. Oh, I'm being charged with this, right? And so we really saw a need to go into schools to educate. So our goals were to educate, really focus on preventative efforts, and then to empower young people to have a voice in this matter that affects them right at 15. So organically, what developed from there was two sets of surveys. First was the Oregon Voter Education Community Awareness Survey. And so we helped with some young leaders through Strive throughout the summer of 2017, go out into the community and actually talk to voters and community members about Measure 11 and get their perspectives about recidivism and public safety and long-term incarceration and restorative justice and other ways to really invest in our communities and to heal people. And we learned that a majority of people in Oregon didn't know what Measure 11 was. And in these conversations with people, people in tears, I can't believe I pay for this. I can't believe I didn't know about this in a state that I've grown up in. You really see how people just, they don't know. They don't even know what Measure 11 is before you even get to the stories and the impact on the people that go through this process at a young age. So that survey reached, I think at this point, 2,262 people across 29 counties in the state of Oregon. And through that process of educating and making people well-informed, people were really able to reflect what their values of a justice system is in the state. But that wasn't good enough. We got to this summer after doing some more workshops in the schools and empowering more youth through our Youth Outreach Leadership Internship, YOLI. We actually had some young CHI youth come into the schools with us and actually educate their peers about Measure 11 and did a paid internship. And we decided we need to have a survey that's even more specific because the original survey is a little too broad. If we went to legislators, it's a little bit too general, right? It could be perceived that way. So the legislative bill support survey was started on August 1st. There was actually like a little barcode at the entrance when you came in. That barcode, actually, if you open your camera and just put it over the barcode, it'll send you to the link. Little 2018 barcode promotion there. So that survey has 6 specific elements of Measure 11 regarding age, second looks, the sentence lengths, felony convictions, it being retroactive, things of that nature. And we were able to reach, in the first 5 weeks, about 515 people so far. Who've been able to not only be further educated, but there's actually links in there that send them to data and research on Oregon's websites that reference Measure 11 so that, people can do their own digging, right, and learn more. And they also have the opportunity on this new survey to actually freely express their perspectives about Measure 11 and really share either what it's done to them or what they've seen done to other people. So make sure you take that survey. There's also a handout, a little poster board over there if you want to have a little takeaway item, share the link with your communities. It's really social media has been a big element of that too, is being able to use our 2018 resources to really spread the message, right? Well, in the process of doing this, 2 different youth that I've been working with for over 2 years now who were doing very well in their lives at the time of that they got taken into custody on Measure 11, they were impacted. And that brought me into a much deeper experience of what happens from the day they're taken into custody, right? These are youth who, have families, right? They're very well connected. They're engaged in pro-social activities. Devon here at a family barbecue that we did with our CHI families. Cheyenne was here with her family before Eagle Creek burned down. This is actually on the Punchbowl path for her birthday, actually. I think that was her 16th birthday. That was her 17th birthday. And I got to see that deeper experience. And, I had to take a step back and realize, and I think everyone should realize, this is a human being, right? This is a young human being who had a moment in their life where they were with the wrong crowd at the wrong place at the wrong time, right? And who, on that last slide you see, have been through almost all, if not all of those traumatic, harmful experiences, right? Adverse childhood experiences. and what I call traumatic harmful development, right? Because this isn't just childhood where they're experiencing poverty, broken homes, domestic violence, drug addiction, gang violence, victimization, abuse. I mean, all these adverse experiences are happening throughout their lives, right? It's through their whole development into their late teens and early adulthood, right? And so that's the thing with Measure 11, a really critical piece of this is that judges don't have the discretion to really look case by case at someone's life, at someone's history. Is this their first offense, right? Were they part of a bad situation, or were they the instigators and leading the way, right? And so, we're harming our youth into submission, right? Our future generation is being harmed by our system. These youth that Shaindia and Devon, the kinds of things that I've seen them go through and while they're in juvenile custody, right, at the detention center here in Multnomah County, becoming suicidal, right, thinking that their life is over at 17, right, not being able to kind of think forward and wish forward, right, because they're looking at 90 months or 70 months. And that's the starting point for the negotiation, right, because a lot of these cases are plea bargain, it's a negotiation. But throughout the process, they're hearing that, if you go to trial and you lose, right, and they keep hearing this fearful dialogue, right, from various people, and they think their life is over, right? And so, in the process of meeting with, Devon and Shaindia, multiple times a week for Shaindia while she was in custody for almost 8 to 10 months, waiting for resolution, and then taking a deal, right? Over 4 years of her life was packaged in that deal, right? It's over a quarter of her life is what she negotiated, right? And so, that human element, I think, is very important to realize. These are going to be our neighbors when they get out. They're going to have a felony on their record, right, even though they committed the crime as a juvenile. So they go through that experience that Kenny is going to describe in the correctional facility. So I won't take your thunder on, describing your experience, but there's also the felony and employment and housing, two of the protective factors, right, that are going to help people transition back into the community. We're saying, yeah, stable housing and a good opportunity at employment. Good luck with that. You've got a felony on your record, right? And you're dealing with felony-friendly jobs and felony-friendly housing. And so if we really want to, create a safer community, right, if we want to improve public safety, we need to heal our youth and heal these families who've been through all this harm throughout their life, right? So I think we'll get to a piece of this where we'll talk about maybe some suggestions and recommendations, but I think what I wanted to bring in was the education piece and helping people be well informed about what's happening in their state, what their vision of justice is, but also the human element and how we can better serve our future youth.
Thank you, Babak. I want to, before we move on, remind people that we are being recorded, and please don't record while you're here, because we are being recorded. Our next speaker, as I think we just talked about a minute ago, is Kenny McGee, who had firsthand experience with the juvenile justice system under Measure 11. Kenny transitioned home to Portland this summer and is currently a full-time apprentice at the Northwest College of Construction. Kenny, will you please share your story that led you to incarceration for 6 years at the Oregon Youth Authority, and how you're handling the transition and what you think could change to help people before they break the law, and how to better support those who serve their time once they come back to the community?
Yeah.
Not a tough question, but
Okay, so I'm gonna tell you a little bit about me, where I come from. Can you hear me?
There you go.
Okay. All right. I'm gonna tell you a little bit about me and where I come from. So I'm from North Portland. I grew up in like a broken home. My father was incarcerated, so I didn't really have male role models or anyone to really look up to. So like, you know, just the other guys I was around, the older guys. I wasn't really good at sports or anything like that. So, like I said, I was just like looking at the older guys. I wanted to like know what it was like to be a man, you know, like what a man was supposed to do. Speak louder, please. Okay. So, on that search of, you know, becoming a man, I ended up having a kid, like 14 years old, and then I kind of got it. Like, I took bits and pieces of like what I was seeing, and mostly what I got from it was like being able to provide for your kid, you know, for your family. So I was looking for jobs and stuff. Got really discouraged because no one was calling me back, and I was underage at that. So, you know, I could really work for nobody. My son and his mother moved to Arizona, and the living situation was bad. There was like bugs, and they wanted to come back, and I felt like, you know, that was my part. Like, I was supposed to bring them back. So I got the right idea to rob a store. I didn't know anything about Measure 11 until after they had already, like, you know, booked me, and I was under the influence, so I wasn't awake until like 2 days later, and then, you know, it's like, what's going on type stuff, you know. They just handed me a pamphlet that said Measure 11 and had all the like charges, like, you know, stuff that you can get sentenced about, you know, under Measure 11. I read about robbery, and I was scared. Like, I thought my life was over. There's like, you know, you're looking at like what this says, you know, 5, 10, 7 years, and then you look at like what's in front of you, this paper that they gave you, and you got like 11 Measure 11s, you know. And then fast forward through that, just being in the system, they don't really teach you any like life skills. So like working and stuff like that, I just had to do that myself. Being able to speak up for yourself, you know, and just like really knowing what you're good at. Like, I feel like going to jail at like such a young age, that was my time of like really figuring out who I am, you know, what I'm good at. Being in there, I never really knew that. I'm trying to find out right now, you know. And it's hard because you're so young, you soak up everything, you know? Like, your mind is a sponge, literally. It's like Play-Doh. You can be molded into whatever. And in there, you're looked at as a criminal. Whatever you did, that's who you are. There's like, really, they're not gonna like, you know, they're not really gonna put that time in. If you were like in need of a mentor, you know, like they're not the ones that's gonna mentor you. You're there to sit down until your time is done. So, I mean, I'm coming home, and just some of the stuff that like I've experienced is like being detached from my family. I don't really have that bond with them. Like my mother, my siblings, we used to all really be close, and it's like now like a lot of my family members I barely recognize, and I don't really have that, like, you know, that bond with them no more. Just like, so along with that, it's just like I'm scared to drive. I can't sleep at night. Usually I wake up in the middle of the night a few times, like fighting in my sleep, like crazy dreams. It's just hard. It's really hard, honestly. And then coming home, and you don't know what to do because you're scared. Everything's different. They just throw you out, you know? And like you're used to people telling you what to do. So my experience, I wanted to stay in the house. I was scared, but I pushed myself and I went and got a job like immediately. I've been home for 2 months. I went and got a job, and then I went and got another job. So I just keep myself busy. Just that's about it. I don't really know what else to say. That's, it's just hard, really. It's hard. It's hard for a lot of my friends too as well. Like I have friends that came home and was home for a few months and was just like, this is not for me. Like, jail was easy for them because everything was set out for them. So they end up going back. I got friends that come home, try to do the right thing, and feel like they were forced back into, crime because they got to get, felony-friendly jobs, felony-friendly, like, housing, and you're put back in areas where, like, things are bad, It's horrible. And then the felony-friendly jobs, that's not enough to help you, like, live. So, yeah. That's it.
Kenny, thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you for being here and for talking to us. I'd like to invite you now to ask each other questions if you want. Kimberly, do you have anything you would like to ask?
Oh, my goodness.
Uh-oh. Or any of you, please.
Kimberly, do you want me to stall for you for just a moment? Okay.
Go for it.
A couple things. There's a couple elements that I think when we're looking at when our young generation is either in custody or in a correctional facility is all the normal life experiences, life events that, at 17, graduation, turning 18, prom, right? Playing for the sports team, your senior year, transitioning into college or a career, all these sorts of things are, they're pushed back, right? You miss this like really important formative part of your life, right? I know with Devon he missed 2 funerals in the last few months, and that really was destroying him to not be able to be at his grandfather's funeral, his uncle's funeral, and knowing he's in custody, right? He's been there for 10 months with no resolution. And another piece is that what's the deterrent of effective Measure 11, right? If 87% of the youth in the schools we've gone to don't know what Measure 11 is, what deterrent effect does it have? At 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, to stop, think, right? The impulse control, the anger management, the judgment, those elements aren't really, that brain development, that science isn't supported by, well, if we have really severe punishments and consequences for these actions, that people will know better, right? And people don't know about it, right? And then you take the brain development piece into it. So what we can't do is bury our youth alive, right?
Hook onto that.
Yeah, let's
Okay.
keep bouncing off each other.
I would like to hook onto that because one of the things that I hear from the Oregon District Attorneys Association, and yes, I'm going to pick on them right this second specifically, is I hear from them, well, Oregon has the lowest juvenile crime rate in the country, or it's much lower than the national average. Let me tell you something. Crime across this country has been falling since 1997, and it's a steep downslope. So if you take the countrywide graph of crime rates and you lay on top of it Oregon's crime rate, and even then you pull out the juvenile crime rate, it's the same shape. And then when we hear that 87% of the kids didn't even know what Measure 11 was, the idea that, well, heck, here's my statute book. The idea that 15, 16, and 17-year-olds are learning what's in this book is ridiculous in order to figure out what they should and shouldn't do in this world. Measure 11 has no deterrent effect. There was a beautiful interview with Mark Brown on OPB last week. It was actually carried nationally. He's talking about life without the possibility of parole sentences for juveniles in Oregon, and how he's taking a run at that with the Oregon Supreme Court right now. And the last person they talked to as part of that story was the district attorney in Deschutes County, who had prosecuted his client. And the parting shot, he said, was, well, Oregon has a much lower juvenile crime rate than the rest of the nation. And OPB didn't even bother to fact check that statement, because it's simply not true. Causation and correlation are not the same things. We all know it, right? Okay. Bugs me. Sorry.
So I have a question here from someone. Is the goal to change parts of Measure 11 or to repeal it altogether?
I would love to take a shot at that. So I think there is sort of a range of things that could happen. And there's sort of, what does our ideal system look like? And then there's what can we push for as a step towards that in Oregon that's realistic. As far as what the system, I think, should look like, and where I would like us to be moving towards, is to look at models in other parts of, not only other parts of the country, but also other parts of the world where things are working well. Norway is a place where things are working well. They have much, much, much lower crime rates than we have. They have drastically lower recidivism rates. So recidivism rates is the rate that a person is going to commit another crime or be convicted of another crime after they've been released from prison. They have much better public safety, and the reason is because they have crafted a system where they treat people who have committed crimes as their neighbors. They say, these are our neighbors. These are our family members, these are our community members, and they say, what can we do to set folks up for success? What can we do to help fix whatever was broken? And instead of a system perpetuating harm and continuing the system adding abuse onto abuse, right? Having a system that heals. And so the country of Norway has the same population approximately as the state of Oregon. Guess how many youth they incarcerate at any given time? Less than 5. Less than 5. They don't incarcerate youth. The reason they don't incarcerate youth is because they understand that keeping youth in the community is actually going to have better outcomes. So it's not like those youth that are in the community are unsupervised. They actually have a 1-to-1 ratio of what we call prison guards or parole officers and people who've been convicted of a crime. They have a 1-to-1 ratio. It's essentially your life coach. They have to go to this like extremely robust education program. It's like a 4-year degree. They are essentially social workers, and they are assigned to a person to help them succeed. And their whole system is based on rewards for good behavior and rewards for learning skills, and they gradually give people more and more freedom as they move through that system. But they do not incarcerate youth, or the youth that they incarcerate is this tiny number. So that's broad goal. As far as what we can do in Oregon right now, there is a juvenile sentencing work group that has been convened by a number of legislators and has a broad group of advocates there. What we are advocating for in that group is fourfold. One is get rid of the automatic waiver into adult court. So instead of a youth being charged with these specific offenses, going into adult court, put it back in the hands of the judge, so that the judge is going to make that decision based on the circumstances of the case, on the maturity of the youth, on what's going to be the best outcome, what's going to be best for public safety, right? And what I believe that we would see happen then is that the youth who are tried as adults is going to just vastly narrow. And then those youth are not going to be subject to those mandatory minimum sentences. They're also not going to lose their right to their second look hearings, right? So get rid of automatic waiver. For those youth that are tried in adult court, make sure that they have access to second look hearings. So for youth that are tried as adults and get long sentences, give them an opportunity to show that they have changed. For youth who are who have sentences where they're serving time in Oregon Youth Authority and then they're transferred to Department of Corrections custody, which can happen at 18, but if the youth does everything they're supposed to in OIA custody, then they're going to get transferred at 25. If they have a short period of time that they're going to be spending at Department of Corrections, so like a year or two, then stop them from give them an opportunity to have essentially what we call a transfer hearing, so that they can show I'm actually safe to return to society now instead of going to Department of Corrections. Because the problem is the skills that kids are developing in Oregon Youth Authority custody, these pro-social skills, are not good for them in Department of Corrections. It's a tough place, right? So you go to Oregon State Penitentiary and talk about your feelings, and you try to make friends. It's probably going to be really challenging for you. And so all of this good work that can be done can get undone. So giving them a transfer hearing. And then the last thing is for those youth who commit very, very serious crimes, like aggravated murder, youth can get life without parole in the state of Oregon. And our Supreme Court has issued a number of opinions about when and how that can happen, and when and how youth should have opportunities for being able to get parole. We want to make sure that Oregon law is in line with the Constitution, and our opinion is that our life without parole scheme as it applies to youth right now is unconstitutional, and so we would like to see changes to that. So that's the really specific things that we're pushing for right now in the next legislative session.
There is a question, and I'm trying to read your handwriting, I'm sorry. I know you spoke of the disparity in racial issues. And what this question says, according to the Oregon Youth Authority statistics, in 2018, 14% of the youth were Black African American versus 3% of the population of Blacks 15 to 24 years old in Oregon. Can you speak about how local economic creates generational trauma and systematic white supremacy has impacted the incarceration rates of Black youth? Well, go ahead. Sorry.
Under Measure 11.
Under Measure 11. Okay, I'm sorry.
I think that's like a graduate seminar course.
That's deep. That's deep.
I can speak mostly anecdotally because I represent people charged with crimes, and I can tell you that my caseload is disproportionately people of color, and that systematic racism and white supremacy, it's in every part of the system. And it's in me. I have to be aware of my own biases too. I'm a white woman. I don't have, and I try very hard to pay close attention to whether I'm giving, especially at my African American youth clients, the same level of service that I'm giving to my white clients. I was horrified. I'm going to make a confession here. I was horrified about 5 years ago. I started just keeping track of how many psychologists I hired, because I was actually trying to keep track of who I was hiring to see my clients and trying to divide work a little bit more evenly among the psychologists that I tend to hire. And I was horrified to discover that for my white clients, I saw them as mentally ill, and I hired a psychologist. My African-American clients were a problem, and I wasn't hiring psychologists at nearly the same rate for them as I was for my white clients. I cried and then started keeping track, actually, very closely of whether or not I was, fixing that particular problem. So everyone in this system, everybody in the system needs to be aware of their bias, and how do we fix it? I don't know. I don't know. I try my best to do what I can in my little corner of it. But how do we stop institutional poverty? And when do we as a community decide that it is important to spend our resources? Because look, we tell the world what we think is important by the money that we spend. By where our tax dollars are allocated, we tell the world what we think is important. And when we tell kids in poverty and in racially segregated neighborhoods that we're not going to put the nice park in your neighborhood, we're going to put it down in Westmoreland, we're going to spend the money to put that, new stuff down in Westmoreland, you're sending a message with that. You're telling the people in that community what their worth is in your society. And how do we fix it? I think we need to make demands that it be fixed, but it takes.
I'm sorry, I don't think it was clear.
So probably not. Also, I'm like, oh my God.
What impact do you think systematic white supremacy has had on the rates of the incarceration rates of Black youth under Measure 11? So not necessarily, poor youth or other youth of color,
Sure.
specifically Black youth, when they are 14% of OYA and only 3%
Of the population.
the general population.
Yeah, I think it has everything to do with white supremacy and with biases, and partly with economic biases and everything else. When we start looking at at the very beginning at Black children who are born to Black moms, and we're removing those kids from their moms at a higher rate than you're removing white kids from their parents. Because Black moms are bad moms. You're sending messages from the very beginning about your worth, and then the rest of us internalize those messages about worth. And then when you put a kid in the Donna Lee Long sweatsuit, because they wear little sweatsuits, and you put them next to a white lady who's supposed to be protecting that kid as their lawyer, it's easy that you can point to the bad guy at that table.
What I'd like to take a moment, and I don't mean to
Sorry.
cut you off at all.
Am I? Yeah.
No, I really want to hear from Kenny.
Yeah.
I want to know, and there's lots of questions here about it. You have the firsthand knowledge. I worked in domestic violence for a long time and with homeless, and I felt it was critical to hear from the people who had experienced or had been put in the circumstances. I want to hear from you. We want to hear from you. When you were incarcerated, Were there services for you? How did you, when people are coming out, what is there for them on the outside? Is there a conduit as you're leaving that you can connect to as you leave and are back at home?
Honestly, there's supposed to be some stuff provided for you while you're in there, like African American group and stuff like that. But in some facilities, you don't really get that. You'll have someone come in, and all y'all do is just sit there and watch TV. You know, like there's not really a lot of people that like come in and sit down and try to like make unity, you know, inside, because it's a lot of different like dudes come from different backgrounds, so there's always like animosity, and it's just like being in there, like, so some like staff won't even like you, and you won't even know why. I don't really know if it's like, I don't really think color has anything to do with it. It's just they go off of what they read without really taking the chance to like get to know you. But as far as like being out and having like a police officer like come to you and question you because of the way you look or the way you're dressed or you know, the way you walk or whatever, I feel like that in a way, I feel like that's like, I feel like they judging me, you know? Like they automatically think that I'm trouble. They want to search you. I've been searched in the middle of the street because he said, you know, look like a duck, you know, talk like a duck, walk like a duck, it must be a duck, you know?
So I'm sorry, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, that was it.
The expectation, and I know we're here to talk about Measure 11 and the extreme of it. But youth, I ask, youth who are incarcerated, what do we do for them while they're incarcerated? Is it really just a punitive system that says, you did this, you're going in, you come out, and we'll wait and see what happens? Or what is our expectation while somebody is incarcerated? What are our goals? What are our objectives to make that not perpetuate itself?
Well, I mean, I think we first have to have an understanding of kind of what's the quality of the services that the youth are getting in the correctional facilities, and who the people are that are providing those services to the youth, and the environment. And I'm talking like visually the environment, right? These youth it looks like a prison, right? If you haven't been to a correctional facility, I think the closest one is McLaren. Just drive to Woodburn, right? And just take a look at what it looks like on the outside and see how you feel about that, right? The youth are on the inside, right? Where the quality of the services, and from, 2 years of experience at the various correctional facilities seeing my youth, there are some very good, committed, dedicated staff at these facilities, some. But some does not shape the experience of Kenny and other youth, where the majority are not like the outliers, right? Who really care, who want to make a human connection, right? And so there's school, there are jobs, there's basketball and recreational activities that they get to participate in. It is different than OSP. It's different than the adult system, for sure. That's why if they turn 25 and there's only 12 to 24 months left on their sentence, we should not be having them go to the adult system, right? Because recidivism goes up significantly, right? But I think you referenced like other countries and kind of what they're doing. I saw a video on Germany and their system, and their outcomes and their data. And their facility, actually, it reminded me, it kind of looks like the Oak Creek Youth Correctional Facility where Cheyenne is. And it's the one girls facility in the state. And there's actually, from the time you walk in into their courtyard, there's like a pond, and there's 2 ducks and their babies, and the little ducks there. There's the sports. There's a lot of interaction and human connection. And when I saw the video this morning, it reminded me of Oak Creek. And I've sat down with Shai and the unit coordinators and the unit manager and the staff, and really seen how much they really care about these young girls and how much they're trying to help them develop. But it looks different. It looks different there than the other correctional facilities that have the young men.
Are outside organizations able to come in
As volunteers,
and to
or if they work directly with the youth.
Yeah, to work directly to prepare. I know when I worked in domestic violence, we had a jail program, and I was able to go in weekly and prepare people, get them, what are you going to do? Where are you going to live? How are we going to help you? So when you walk out the door, you don't walk out alone. Are we allowing that?
Yeah, yes. There are programs. There are programs where organizations can come in. Janus Youth Programs in particular does a lot of partnership with different folks. My husband actually taught a electronic music course at McLaren for a while. There's people who teach all sorts of different things. At the same time, we don't have those programs are limited, and so there's only a certain number of youth who can get into them. They're not accessible to every single youth. And I think regardless, I do want to say, I think that, our organization's also allowed in to suggest changes. Like I go to Oregon Youth Authority facilities frequently, and they engage with us on how can they do things better. And I think that there are things that they are doing better than they were in the past. For example, we've worked with them really extensively over reducing their use of solitary confinement for youth. And so, I applaud Oregon Youth Authority for the steps they have taken. At the same time, I think that as long as we are incarcerating youth, we are not doing things right. Youth are going to succeed better in the community with whatever these programs are that we're putting into a correctional facility. If we're providing those programs in the community and providing the services and the support that youth need in the community, they're going to do better. So as long as we're incarcerating youth, we're doing it wrong.
Can I add a thought to that
Go right ahead.
briefly? I think this ties into the second looks piece in that, if there is a situation, and there are situations where, a young person has engaged in dangerous behavior and has harmed a person or a family, the community, and so there may be a need to have I've heard the term, they might just need to sit down for a little bit, right? But we're not talking about 70 months. That's not a timeout, right? And I think this is where one of the things that people have communicated through the survey is that they really support quarterly second looks, right? Not just at the halfway point, and if it doesn't work out at your three-year mark, which is your best case scenario, then sorry, you got 3 more years to go. We're talking every quarter, right? So on a 70-month sentence, that's every year and a half. And I worked in a residential treatment center for almost 5 years, and I saw what a year and a half of quality services of rehabilitation can do, not only for someone to develop, but really understand the harm they've done to someone. And now we're getting into restorative justice, right? Is repairing the relationship and really bringing the victims of these crimes into the discussion. So I think quarterly second looks, I hope that, if legislation is really looking at second looks, which is what's happening, is that we don't settle for at the halfway point, that every quarter someone gets a chance to have the victim or victims, the treatment team, the family, everyone come together and let's see where this person is at and are they ready, right? And then let's have, a village around them for when they are transitioning, right? To be able to get good housing and to get a good job, right? So that they can reintegrate and be our neighbor.
So you talked about that there are programs while children are being are incarcerated, and there's school and there's other classes. Is school mandatory? Do the kids come out with GEDs or high school graduation? Did you, Kenny, come out with?
Yeah. I got my diploma in there. Like they offer it. My bad. They offer it.
There's no
and-
truant officer there to tell you that you have to be in school.
Nah, they make sure that you go.
Yeah, okay.
You know, they of course they can't make you do the work, but they make sure that you go. And they do offer like certain like programs, like there's like pathways where it's like behavior based and looks at like a little bit of like drug abuse. There's like ART, that's like anger replacement. I forgot.
Training.
Yeah, training, stuff like that. And I feel like all that is like helpful, but again, it should be done like outside of the jail, you know? Because like, I mean, so like doing time, like, you know, like you learn your lesson after like a year and a half, 2 years, honestly. The rest is just excessive, you know? So I say like, you know, you do that little time, you know, you come home and you have a village, you know? You have your groups that you go to, you have a mentor, someone that can help you because, you know, you've been gone for some time and just like kind of guide you to where you need to go.
So what you're saying is really, will a year and a half of being incarcerated, or 7 years of being incarcerated, do any more than a year and a half?
Right.
I mean, that is, exactly. So,
You reach a point of where you're failing to thrive. You're not growing anymore. You're just doing time, right?
And there's research, at least in the adult system, that shows that actually a shorter period of time of incarceration and then intensive supervision on the outside is actually much more effective in reducing recidivism than just a long period of time in prison. And it bears out with juveniles, and if Kenny had probably been appropriately treated in the juvenile system, he would have had access to a juvenile court counselor who would have had an expertise in pedealing with kids specifically who had like your struggles, and there would have been peer mentors available for him, and there would have been an opportunity for restorative justice to sit down and make it right with the person that owned the store. He could have paid fines and fees by working in what we call Project Payback here in Multnomah County, which allows kids to do community service, and they get awarded a minimum wage, and that goes to paying restitution, which is money that the victim of the crime might be out, and it's a much more restorative model, and kids that are treated in juvenile court generally have a much lower level of recidivism than adults do in general. And that's very much true for juvenile sex offenders. Juvenile sex offenders are treated under ballot measure 11, and nobody really likes to talk about them, but they exist, and juvenile sex offenders are the least likely to reoffend.
I have another question here about waiving the second look hearing. It says, what is the purpose of having a child waive second look hearing, and why wouldn't we allow all kids to have one?
So we don't have anyone on the panel who is advocating for waiver of second look. So I don't want to put words in anyone's mouth. But What I understand from conversations that I've had with folks about things like second look hearings or transitional leave programs or good time programs, anything where someone serves less than the full extent of their sentence based on behavior, based on how they're doing while they're incarcerated, that runs contrary to the idea of what's called sort of truth in sentencing, and that truth in sentencing is the idea that when a person is sentenced to a specific amount of time, that they should serve that specific amount of time, and if they don't serve that specific amount of time, then it does a disservice to the victim of the crime, because the victim of the crime has an expectation that that person was going to serve a certain amount of time, and then all of a sudden later on in the system that person is now being released early, and the idea is that would have a negative impact on the victim. My perspective on that is that if the victim is adequately informed ahead of time about the possibility that that's going to happen, that there's still truth in the sentencing because they were informed ahead of time about what was going to happen. I also think that giving people who are incarcerated the incentive to do a good job, right? And to engage in all of the programs that we want them to engage in and to try really hard, that has a positive impact not only on that individual and then on the rest of society, because of the way that person is going to then learn skills that they can use when they return to society. It also has a positive impact on the corrections officers and the people who work in our corrections facilities, because if people don't have any incentive to do good, or we're taking away some of the incentive to do good, right? Then that's going to impact people's behavior. But this idea of truth in sentencing is what I have heard is sort of the rationale for not wanting to give people an opportunity to get out of incarceration sooner.
Could I actually add something to that? Because they have historically, when I've had a child charged with a ballot measure 11 offense, in order to avoid that mandatory minimum sentence, which, remember, a judge has no discretion to give my client anything less than if we go to trial and lose. The district attorney's office would often make an offer that would let my client plead to a non-ballot measure 11 sentence with agreement that he would be treated in adult court, so he'd have to sign a waiver into adult court on that non-ballot measure 11 sentence, and the only way they would give my client something other than the ballot measure 11 sentence was if he or she agreed to waive that second look. Mm-hmm. So that might be where that's coming, that might be where that question is.
I feel kind of silly asking this question, because the league is a nonpartisan organization, but that.
So are we.
Yes, I know. Measure 11 was created during what we considered, or what was considered, a tough on crime time. Will there ever be a time when we're not there?
Real quick, actually, tough on crime really started in the 70s with Nixon, right? And then the war on drugs with Reagan. And then President Clinton, a Democrat, after many Republicans, said, I'm going all in on being tough on crime, right? Federal crime bill, militarizing the police. 3 strikes happened in California. We had Measure 11. So like over a 3-decade period, over 35 years, it got tougher and tougher, right? To the point where we reached in the 90s, that has now affected Oregon for 24 years, right? We're 24 years into Measure 11 with some policy changes in the last 2 years, with the Tier 2, but no significant changes, right? And so I think to answer the question directly, over the last 10 to 15 years, there's a lot of research that's coming out about our outcomes in our systems and what we're doing to people. And And that's really helping provide a lot of context as to what would be more effective, what would create better community safety. And a lot of, I'm personally seeing this, a lot more organizations developing partnerships to really do this together, right? Going out in the community and educating voters, right? And voters as the constituents to the representatives and the senators, really reflecting what their values are. So I think as people are getting more well-informed and using research to really guide decisions using data and brain science development, we're seeing movement, not just, we're not working just on movement here in Oregon, we're seeing it happen throughout the United States. So I think we are getting, as David has said, getting smart on crime, Partnership for Safety and Justice and Oregon Justice Research Center and the ACLU, and a lot of organizations are really seeing and communicating the need to, let's be wise, let's use the information we have, and let's let everyone know what that information is so we can make better decisions.
Can I also be really clear about tier 2? That's not in the law, that's a policy.
It's a policy change.
Change from Multnomah County. They could take that policy away at any time.
It's a practice.
Yeah, I don't expect they would, but it doesn't exist in every county.
Okay, one more. Kimberly, I know you
Yeah,
want to say
so
something.
Sorry.
okay.
No, it's great. I just wanted to say, just to piggyback on that, we are seeing reforms across the country. We're seeing reforms in progressive states. We're seeing reforms in conservative states. We're seeing bipartisan reform on this issue. We are also seeing public opinion polling changing. A 2017 Youth First Initiative poll across the United States showed 83% of the public supports reform of the youth justice system, and 79% specifically said they wanted to focus on rehabilitation instead of incarceration. I'm also looking at the a Crime Survivors Speak survey that recently happened on victims' views of our criminal justice system, and that polling found that 6 in 10 people who were the victims of crime preferred shorter prison sentences and more spending on prevention and rehabilitation. So I think what we are seeing is a sea change in our public opinion because of all of our understanding of the fact that what we're doing is not working, and that we are incarcerating more people per capita than anywhere else in the world, and that just doesn't fit with our view of who we should be as a society.
I really like to thank each one of our speakers for sharing their expertise and thoughtfulness as we try to improve the outcomes for young people, and we've become enmeshed in the juvenile justice system. I'd like to give Kenny the last word before we close. I'm not an easy mother, so I want, if you have something that you think we should know, or you think you could have used or would have been helpful to you while incarcerated or before, what would you tell us?
Everyone can hear me, right? All right. I would say, like, if you are going to sit somebody down to do that, like, much time, have someone that when they come home, that can, like, kind of guide them, to what they need to do, like, where they need to go. Because, I mean, after the time is done, you're really just, like, lost. You're trying to figure out, like, how to adult and just, like, catch up with everything else. So, yeah, just have someone there to help.
Kenny, thank you. Thank you, all of you. It was an exceptional presentation. Thank you. So this concludes the recorded part of our panel discussion, and I want to thank again the panel for helping us understand the challenges and opportunities that are ahead of us. On the League of Women Voters website, you will find the information about Metro East Community schedule, the broadcast schedule, and we encourage you to watch that with your friends to learn more about it. So thank you again to our donors, the Multnomah Bar Foundation and the Carol and Selma Sailing Foundation, the Metro East Community Media for their support of this program, and thanks again to Multnomah County for the use of this space, and to our audience and volunteers. This has been a production of the Metro East Community Media and a presentation of the League of Women Voters of Portland Education Fund. Thank you.